Madonna is one of the most influential artists in the history of popular music, who has sold over 300 million records worldwide and is recognized as the best-selling female artist of all time. She owns a series of iconic albums like A Virgin, True Blue, Like a Prayer, Ray of Light, and Confessions on a Dance Floor. Each era redefined music and popular culture. Madonna has won 7 Grammy Awards, many international music awards, and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Her tours continuously broke revenue records, making her the most successful female touring artist in history. Not only in music, she also expanded her influence into film, fashion, and business with Maverick Records, helping shape the way artists control their careers. Madonna is not just a singer, but a cultural icon, a pioneer in breaking boundaries of gender, religion, and personal freedom, who has directly influenced many generations of artists after her like Britney Spears, Lady Gaga, and Beyoncé. But behind all those achievements is a life built on losses and fears that never leave. When she was still a child, she lost her mother without understanding what happened, leaving an emotional void that could never be filled and an obsession with abandonment that followed her throughout her life. Her later relationships, from her marriage to Sean Penn to her family life with Guy Ritchie, all carried traces of control and trauma. When her son Rocco chose to leave her to live with his father, it was not just a family conflict, but a repetition of the pain from her childhood. Madonna did not stop. She continued to work, continued to perform, continued to control everything as a way not to face the feeling of loss. Her willpower did not come from perfection, but from not allowing herself to collapse, even though inside there was still a part that had never been healed. Before stepping into the journey behind the spotlight of Madonna, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way of respect for the woman who had to become strong when there were no other choices left. And if you believe that behind every legend there is always a story that has never been fully told, please stay until the end, because the next part will take you back to where all her pain began. Born in the state of Michigan, in a strict Catholic family, Madonna's childhood did not begin with dreams of stage lights or applause, but with cold mornings, repeated prayers, and rules that could never be broken. In that house, everything had its order, from the way of dressing, the way of speaking, to the way of expressing emotions. And for a child, that was not just a framework, but also an invisible pressure, where love did not come naturally, but had to be earned to receive. Her father was a person who believed in discipline, believed that children must be strong and not allowed to be weak. Her mother, though gentler, still placed faith in raising children with strictness and standards. And Madonna, from a very early age, learned that to be seen, to be recognized, she had to do more than what was asked. She had to stand out more, had to be better, had to become the version that others expected, not because she wanted it that way, but because she feared that if she did not, she would become invisible in her own family. In those meals, in those seemingly simple daily moments, she always carried the feeling that she was being judged, that every action was a test, and if she failed, she might lose the attention, lose the love. That made Madonna never really get to relax like a normal child. She did not learn to accept herself, but learned to perfect herself to the point of almost not allowing mistakes. Each compliment became a rare reward. Each satisfied look became motivation for her to keep trying. But at the same time, it was also a reminder that she had to maintain that standard forever, not allowed to step back, not allowed to weaken. And gradually, that shaped a person who did not know how to stop, did not know how to be satisfied with what she already had, because deep inside there always existed a fear that if she stopped trying, everything would disappear. Madonna began to see the world through the lens of competition, where everything had to be achieved, where love was not something certain, but something that could be lost at any time if she was not good enough. Because of that, her ambition was not just a desire for success, but an emotional survival need. She needed to become the best, not only to beat others, but to prove to herself that she deserved to exist, that she deserved to be loved. But the paradox was that the more she tried to control everything, the further she moved away from the sense of security she was seeking, because love could not be maintained by perfection. And when a child grows up with the belief that her value depends on how well she performs, she will become an adult who never feels enough, never believes that she has been kept. The years in Michigan not only created the foundation for Madonna's discipline and iron will, but also planted in her a lifelong insecurity, an insecurity that made her unable to accept weakness, unable to fully trust any relationship, and always feel that she had to keep moving forward, even though inside she was already tired, because stopping meant facing the feeling she had been running away from since she was a child. The feeling that if she was not strong enough, not good enough, not perfect enough, she might be left behind once again. And then there came a day when all the rules, all the efforts, and all the attempts of that little girl became meaningless. The day when Madonna's world did not collapse with a loud noise, but with a silence so deep it was impossible to comprehend. Her mother passed away from illness when she was still too young to understand what permanent loss meant. There was no complete explanation, no conversation long enough to help a child understand that the person she loved would not come back anymore. There was only the sudden disappearance and a cold void that replaced everything that had once been safe. In the first days, Madonna still waited, still believed that her mother had just gone somewhere and would return, because a child cannot accept that love can end without a goodbye. But time passed, and the truth gradually emerged in the cruelest way. No one told her exactly what had happened. No one sat down to help her face that pain, and so Madonna had to fill the void by herself with immature but haunting thoughts. She began to wonder if she had done something wrong, if it was because she had not been good enough or obedient enough that her mother had left. And that very question followed her throughout her life, not as a memory, but as a wound that had never been healed. The house that once had warmth now became unfamiliar. The familiar habits disappeared. The familiar sounds were no longer there. And in that silence, Madonna not only lost her mother, she lost the feeling that she was kept in this world. When her father remarried, the change did not come gently, but felt like another confirmation that what had been lost would never return. A new woman stepped into the house, bringing new rules and different ways of caring. And even without ill intent, that presence made Madonna feel pushed further away, as if her position had been replaced, as if her story had been rewritten without asking for her opinion. She did not know where to put her emotions. She could not call it betrayal, but she also could not accept it as something normal. And so a distance began to form, not only between her and her stepmother, but between her and her own family. Madonna began to withdraw into her own thoughts, but at the same time she rebelled in the only way she knew. She rebelled not because she wanted to oppose, but because that was the only way to feel she still existed. She began to break the rules, to challenge the limits, no longer trying to be the perfect child as before, because in her eyes, perfection could no longer keep what was most important. She learned not to fully trust any kind of stability, because if something as beautiful as her mother's love could disappear, then nothing was certain. That rebellion was not just behavior, but a profound psychological reaction, a way to regain control in a world where she had once lost everything without being prepared. And gradually, Madonna was no longer the little girl trying to be recognized, but became someone who always sought to control everything around her. Because control meant not being surprised, not being abandoned once again. But the price of that control was that she grew further away from the feeling of being loved naturally. Because when everything had to be held tightly, there was no room for freedom and no room for trust. The years after her mother's death did not just change Madonna, but shaped her entire way of seeing the world, the way she loved, the way she reacted to loss, and the way she built her life later on. It was not a temporary shock, but the starting point of a chain of choices reactions, and relationships that all carried the mark of a fear formed very early, a fear that anything she loved could leave without warning. And because of that, she had to become stronger, had to control more, had to go further, even if that meant trading the peace she had never truly had. And then, when the wounds from her family could no longer be hidden by rebellion, Madonna made a decision that she later admitted was both reckless and desperate. She left Michigan and went to New York with almost nothing in her hands, only a few dozen dollars, a dream that had not yet taken shape, and a fear of abandonment greater than anything else. That city did not welcome her with lights or opportunities. It welcomed her with coldness, with cramped rooms, with long days when she did not know where the next meal would come from. Madonna did not come to New York to become a star, at least not at the beginning. She came there to survive, to find a place where she could start over. But instead of a new beginning, she stepped into a battle for survival where every day was a test. She took any job she could get, from waitressing to selling goods to dancing. There were no choices, no privileges, only the necessity to keep living. There were days when she barely ate anything. There were nights when she slept in spaces where safety was never guaranteed. And in that environment, Madonna not only faced poverty, but also faced situations she was not prepared for, people ready to take advantage of weakness, moments when she had to learn to say no when there was no one standing behind her to protect her. There were experiences that later she recalled with more silence than words, because they were not just memories but deep cuts in the way she saw the world. New York was not only a place that tested her will, but also a place that forced her to grow up faster than a person should have to. She learned to observe, learned to assess danger, learned not to trust too quickly and not to depend on anyone, because she understood that in a city like that, dependence could become a fatal weakness. Step by step, Madonna built a shell for herself, not to become cold, but to protect herself, to make sure no one could hurt her the way life had once done. She began to control not only her actions but also her emotions, not showing fear, not letting others see her instability, because she knew that the weak were usually the first to be hurt. But the price of becoming strong too early was that she gradually lost the ability to trust, lost the feeling that someone could stay without conditions. In those months and years, art was not a romantic path. It was a way to hold on, something that helped her keep the feeling that she was moving forward, even though the path was full of risks. Every step in New York not only brought Madonna closer to her career, but also pushed her further away from the person she once was. Because to survive, she had to change, had to become tougher, had to accept things she might not have thought of before. And in that process, Madonna not only learned to live alone, she learned to believe that she alone was enough, that she did not need anyone else, that depending on others was dangerous. And that very belief, although it had helped her get through the hardest times, also became part of the problem later on when she entered relationships where closeness became difficult. Because she had gotten used to keeping distance, used to controlling, used to not letting anyone come too close, New York did not save Madonna. It forged her into a different person, a person who was stronger, more determined, but also lonelier. And from there, her journey was no longer about seeking opportunities, but about continuing to move forward at all costs, even if that cost might be her own ability to feel safe, something she had lost long before. From those harsh days when survival had already become instinct, Madonna began to touch the first opportunities in music, not like a sudden miracle, but as the result of near absolute persistence. She did not enter this industry with the naivety of a dreamer, but with the alertness of someone who had understood that if she did not create opportunities for herself, no one would do it for her. The small performances, the demo recordings, the meetings that mostly led nowhere, all of them were slow but indispensable steps. Madonna observed everything around her, from the way other artists built their images to the way audiences reacted to new things. And right in that process, she realized something that not everyone understood from the beginning, that in this world, having a good voice alone was not enough. Talent alone was not enough. What decided who would be remembered and who would be forgotten lay in the way that person appeared before the public, in the way they told their own story. And from that moment, Madonna did not just want to become a singer. She wanted to become an image, an icon, something that others could not ignore. She began to actively build her own style, not following templates, not obeying safe standards, but always finding ways to create difference, from the way she dressed, the way she performed, to the way she appeared before the media. Everything was calculated, not simply to attract attention, but to control the way the world perceived her. In that process, Madonna gradually created a clear distance between her real self and her public image. One side was the girl who had gone through loss, who had been afraid, and had to protect herself in an unforgiving city. And the other side was the strong, confident woman who was not afraid of judgment, who always took control of every situation. That distance did not appear immediately. It formed little by little, every time she decided to hide an emotion, every time she chose to show a stronger version instead of her true self. And over time, those two versions became more and more separated, to the point that even Madonna herself could hardly go back completely to who she was before. But that separation gave her something she had always craved, which was control. For the first time in her life, she could decide how she was perceived, how she was judged, no longer placed in a passive position like when she was a child, no longer having to wait for recognition from others, but actively creating it. And that very feeling of control became a powerful driving force, making Madonna push the limits of herself further and further. She constantly adjusted her image, constantly changed to fit what she believed was necessary to survive and grow in an ever-changing industry. But every change was also a time when she had to sacrifice a part of her authenticity. Every time she controlled things more tightly was also a time when she had to keep more distance from her true emotions. And although that helped her advance further in her career, it also made her increasingly accustomed to living in a constructed version, a version that the world loved but did not always reflect the person inside. Madonna did not stop. She continued to move forward, continued to perfect her image, continued to control every aspect of her career, because she understood that if she loosened up, if she let things go out of control, she could lose everything she had built. And for someone who had lost too much from a very early age, holding tightly to what she had was not just a choice, but an indispensable need. But deep inside, amid all that success and control, there still existed a question that she had never truly answered. That when everything was perfectly controlled, where was her real self? And whether anyone could still see it or not. And then, when everything started to roll, Madonna did not just step into the music industry. She plunged straight into its center at a speed that even insiders could not keep up with what was happening. Her first music products were not only well received, but also gained attention in a way that very few new artists could achieve. From catchy melodies to bold images, Madonna quickly became a name the public could not ignore. Every appearance of hers came with curiosity, debate, and even judgment. And right in that whirlwind, she began to realize that she was not just creating music. She was creating a phenomenon, an icon that could go beyond the framework of an ordinary singer. The shocking performances, the image choices that did not follow norms, all contributed to building a Madonna that the world was both attracted to and felt uncomfortable with. And that was not accidental, because she understood that in a world where everything could easily be forgotten, attention was power, and if she did not seize it, she would be replaced by someone else faster than anyone could realize. But that attention did not come for free. It brought waves of criticism from the media, from society, from those who did not accept the way she broke boundaries. Madonna was called provocative, considered to go beyond moral standards, turned into the center of debates that sometimes went beyond music. And while many other artists might step back under that pressure, she did the opposite. She went further, bolder, pushing what was controversial to an even higher level, not because she did not feel the pressure, but because she realized that if she had to be noticed, it was better to actively control how that attention happened. Madonna began to use controversy as a tool, not to destroy her image, but to keep it always at the center of the conversation. Every time she was criticized, no longer felt like a failure, but became an opportunity to affirm that she was still existing, still influencing, still controlling her own story. And that very strategy took her from an artist to a cultural icon of popular culture, a person who not only created music, but also shaped the way society viewed gender, power, and personal freedom. But along with the expansion of influence came the increase in pressure, because once she had become an icon, maintaining that position became many times more difficult than achieving it. Madonna could no longer stop, could no longer just repeat what she had done before, because the audience and the media always waited for something new, something different, something surprising. And if she could not meet that, she risked being replaced by the very people she had once inspired. That created a loop she could not escape. The more successful she became, the more she had to innovate. The more she innovated, the more she had to push her own limits further. And each time like that, the distance between her real self and the image she built grew even larger. Madonna not only had to face the outside world, she also had to face the pressure from herself, a pressure that did not allow her to become normal, did not allow her to stop and just exist as a human being, because once she had become an icon, going back to being a normal person was almost impossible. And while the world continued to praise her strength, her boldness, and her ability to control, few realized that those very things were also what kept her in a state where she could never rest, a state where every step forward came with a new worry, that if one day she no longer attracted attention, no longer made the world look her way, then everything she had built could vanish as quickly as it had once appeared. And for a person who had spent her whole life avoiding the feeling of being forgotten, that was something she was never ready to accept. From that point on, when standing still meant being replaced, Madonna began to enter a cycle that even she herself would later find hard to stop. It was constantly changing, not only changing her music, but also changing her image, her style, the way she spoke, the way she appeared, and the way she wanted the world to see her. In each era, Madonna became a different version, sometimes rebellious, sometimes provocative, sometimes profound, sometimes cruel. And all those versions had their own appeal, all created influence, and all helped her maintain her position at the center of popular culture. But the more she changed, the more she had to move away from something important, which was stability in her personal identity. Because when a person constantly transforms to adapt, the boundary between development and losing oneself becomes more fragile than ever. Madonna was not only labeled by the world with many different personas through each era, but she also gradually accepted those personas as part of herself, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to continue existing in an industry that always demanded novelty, needed to not be left behind. And gradually, the question, who is the real Madonna, was no longer a question outsiders asked, but became a question she herself had to face. Yet it was not easy to find the answer, because every time she tried to return to a version closer to her true self, the pressure from the public and from her career pulled her back to the constructed image, to what had already been proven effective. And so a loop formed. She changed to survive, then had to continue changing to avoid repetition. And in that process, the distance between the person inside and the image outside grew larger and larger. Madonna became dependent on the very things she had created, dependent on the strong, bold, unpredictable image, because that was what had brought her to the top. But it was also what made it difficult for her to let go. Because if she let go, she risked losing the position she had sacrificed so much to achieve. And that was not just a professional worry, but a personal fear. The fear that if she was no longer an icon, she would have to face herself, face the emotions she had learned to hide for so long. In the rare moments when the lights went out, when there were no more audiences, no more cameras, Madonna was no longer the image the world knew. She returned to the person inside, but that return did not bring the relief people might think, because that person had been left behind for too long, had become unfamiliar, had become hard to accept, and precisely because of that, returning to the lights, to the controlled image, became the safer place, the place where she knew who she was, knew what she had to do, knew what was expected of her. And over time, Madonna not only maintained the image, she lived in it, existed in it, and depended on it, as a way to keep her life structured and meaningful. But the price of that dependence was that she found it increasingly difficult to connect with her true self, difficult to trust relationships that were not based on image, difficult to feel acceptance without having to prove herself. And while the world continued to see a Madonna who was always innovating, always strong, always leading, inside, she was a person who had to keep running so as not to be caught by the very questions she had never had time to answer. That when all the layers were removed, when there was no more image to rely on, what would be left? And whether that would be enough to make her feel she still had value or not. And while the outside image became more and more perfect, more and more tightly controlled to the point it was almost impossible to penetrate, Madonna's personal life began to step into an area that could not be controlled in the way she was used to. When she met Sean Penn, that relationship did not begin with stability or peace, but with a powerful, intense energy that almost exploded from the very first moments. They were attracted to each other, not only because of fame, but because both carried a great emotional intensity, a need for control, and an insecurity that was not easily visible from the outside. And that very similarity was both what drew them closer and the reason everything quickly became tense. Their love was not like the gentle stories people usually expect. It was like a continuous collision between two people who were not used to yielding, not easy to trust, and both carried unhealed wounds from the past. In the early days, Madonna felt like she had found someone who could understand the intensity with which she lived, someone who was not threatened by her strength. But over time, that very intensity became a burden. Conflicts began to appear more frequently. Arguments no longer were just small disagreements, but became confrontations where neither wanted to back down. In that relationship, control was no longer a personal tool but became a struggle between two sides. Each person tried to hold on to their own position, to hold on to their own sense of safety, and in that process, both were hurt in ways that were not easy to repair. There were periods when the tension rose to the point where there was no room left for peace, moments where love and pain became hard to distinguish, where staying no longer brought safety but leaving was not easy either. Because Madonna was not only facing a relationship, she was facing a part of herself, a part that had become used to attaching to what was intense, even when it came with pain. And that was the reason leaving became more difficult. Because leaving was not just ending a relationship, but also admitting that she had chosen wrong, that she had not been able to control the situation the way she believed she could, and for a person who had built her entire life based on control, that was not easy to accept. Therefore, Madonna stayed longer than many people could understand, trying to hold on to what had begun with the belief that everything could change, that love could be fixed if there was enough effort. But there were cracks that could not be filled by willpower alone. And when the relationship gradually reached the point of no return, ending it did not bring immediate relief, but left another void, another wound, a proof that not everything could be controlled, no matter how hard one tried. The divorce from Sean Penn was not just an event in Madonna's personal life. It became a milestone, an experience that shaped the way she viewed love afterward. A reminder that strength did not protect her from hurt, that control did not guarantee stability. And from then on, Every subsequent relationship carried a part of that memory, a part of caution, a part of the fear that anything that began with strong emotions could end in a similar way. Madonna continued to move forward, continued to build her career, continued to maintain the image she had created. But inside, that relationship left a mark that was not easy to erase, a mark that made her even more careful, made her control even more, but at the same time made her harder to open up, harder to trust. And while the world still saw a strong Madonna who could not be shaken, few realized that behind it was a person who had gone through a collision with no victory, only expensive lessons and wounds that time could not completely heal. After all those collisions, Madonna did not stop. She did not allow herself to stop. Instead, she moved faster, did more, pushed herself further into the center of fame and power. And in this period, her career reached a peak that very few people in music history could touch. The following albums continued to succeed. The tours stretched across many continents. The contracts, the revenue figures, all confirmed her position not just as a star, but as a force in the entertainment industry. Madonna did not just make money, she created a system in which she controlled almost every aspect, from production to promotion to image. And every move was calculated to ensure that she was always ahead, always the one leading, not the one following. But to maintain that position, the price was not small. Her work schedule became so packed that there was almost no space left. Day after day was filled with training sessions, recording, meetings, traveling, performing. Everything happened continuously, like a machine that never stopped. And in that spin, Madonna did not just work. She existed in work because that was where she felt she could control everything, where she felt she had clear value, where she felt she would not be abandoned. But at the same time, that very busyness took away from her things she did not realize immediately, which were time, stability, and the ability to build lasting relationships. Because when everything in life revolved around work, what lay outside it became more fragile. Personal relationships did not have enough space to grow, did not have enough presence to become deep. And over time, Madonna began to realize that around her there were not many people who stayed for long. Not because she did not want to keep them, but because her life did not allow that to happen easily. Connections became short-lived. Relationships did not have enough time to become support, and even though she was still always surrounded by people, by colleagues, by audiences, the feeling of loneliness did not disappear because of that. Physical presence could not replace emotional connection, and that became clearest in the moments when the lights went out, when the performance ended, when the applause died down, when no one was looking at her with admiration or expectation. In those moments, Madonna was no longer the icon, no longer the controlled image. She returned to herself, and it was exactly then that the void she had tried to fill with work and success appeared most clearly. A void not because of lack of achievements, but because of lack of stability, lack of deep connections, lack of the feeling that someone stayed not because of what she represented but because of who she was. But with a life built on always moving forward, stopping to face that void was not easy. And so Madonna continued to work, continued to create, continued to maintain the pace she had grown used to. Not only for her career, but also because it was the only way she knew to keep the silences from becoming too big. But the faster she ran, the clearer the gap became between what she achieved and what she felt. Because success could fill the schedule, but could not fill emotions. And while the world continued to see a Madonna who never stopped advancing, who never stopped conquering, inside, she was a person beginning to realize that not everything could be solved by doing more. That some things needed time, needed presence, needed stopping. But when she had gotten used to never stopping, learning to slow down became a challenge no less than what she had overcome before. And in that very contradiction, between continuing and stopping, between controlling and letting go, Madonna entered a period where success no longer brought the same certainty as before, but began to come with questions she had never had to face in the early steps of her journey. And then, amid that non-stop rhythm of life, a new role appeared in Madonna's life, a role that could not be controlled by strategy or image. It was becoming a mother. When her first daughter Lourdes was born, her world no longer revolved only around the stage and audiences, but began to revolve around a small life that needed to be protected, needed to be loved, and needed presence. In that moment, Madonna was no longer the icon or the leader of popular culture. She became a woman with a responsibility that no script could prepare her for in advance. And at first, she believed that this love could heal what she had lacked, that becoming a mother could bring the sense of stability she had never had. But very quickly, she realized that love came with a fear greater than anything she had ever experienced. The fear of losing her child, the fear of repeating exactly what had happened with her own mother. And that very fear began to influence the way she raised her child. Madonna not only loved her child, she protected her in an almost absolute way, trying to keep her away from the scrutiny of the media, away from the pressure of fame that she knew too well. She understood that the world she lived in could hurt anyone who was not strong enough, and therefore she did not want her child to face that too soon. But protection gradually turned into control. She applied strict discipline, set clear rules, tried to shape the environment in which her child grew up in the way she believed was safest. And in that process, Madonna did not realize that she was repeating the very model she had once felt limited by when she was little. The only difference was that this time she was the one setting the rules, not the one who had to follow them. But the feeling of being controlled, of being shaped, was not always easy to accept, even when it came from love. And right here, a contradiction began to form between loving and controlling, between the desire to protect and the need to let the child be free. Madonna stood between those two poles, not easily finding balance because every decision was driven by the deep fear inside. The fear that if she loosened up, if she did not control, she might lose her child the way she had once lost her mother. And for a person who had experienced loss at too young an age, accepting risk in love was almost impossible. Therefore, she chose control, chose to set limits, chose to keep everything within the range she could understand and manage. But the price of that control was distance, distance that was not always clear, but gradually appeared in small moments, in the way of communicating, in the way of reacting, and in the way her child began to seek her own space. Madonna kept trying, kept adjusting, but being both a mother and an icon made everything more complicated, because she not only had to raise her child, but also had to protect her from the very world that she herself was part of. And while the world continued to see a strong Madonna who was in control and always knew what she was doing, inside she was a mother learning to love while still carrying the fear of loss. A person who never truly felt safe even though she had tried to create safety for others. And right in that contradiction, between love and control, between protecting and letting go, Madonna continued to move forward, not because she had found the answer, but because she had no other choice except to keep trying, hoping that this time love would not disappear the way it once had. And then, while the efforts of motherhood were still trying to balance between loving and controlling, Madonna stepped into a new chapter that she believed could bring the stability she had always been searching for. It was her marriage to Guy Ritchie. In the early years, everything seemed different, no longer the relationships full of conflict and intensity like before, but a feeling closer to peace. They built a family, had a child together, had a private space that Madonna had once wished for. A place where life did not only revolve around the stage, but also had ordinary moments, meals, quiet evenings, things that seemed simple but held meaning for a person who had grown used to living under pressure and lights. In that period, Madonna tried to become a different version of herself, a woman who not only controlled her career, but also learned to be present in the family, learned to stay instead of always moving. And there were times when that truly brought the feeling she had lacked for so long. The feeling that everything could be stable, that she did not always have to fight to hold on to what she had. But that stability did not last forever, because the differences between them did not disappear. They were only temporarily hidden by the initial efforts. Over time, the differences in lifestyle, in the way they viewed life, and in the way they faced pressure began to appear more clearly. Guy Ritchie had his own world, a different approach to fame and privacy, while Madonna had grown used to controlling everything, used to every decision having to be calculated. And that very difference created distance, not immediately, but gradually, in conversations that no longer resonated, in moments when the two no longer looked in the same direction. Work continued to pull Madonna away from the family space, the tours, the new projects, the commitments she could not give up. And while she believed she could balance it, reality showed that sharing life between two very different worlds was not easy. The pressure came not only from the outside, but also from the expectations they placed on each other. Madonna wanted to keep everything, wanted to have both a career and a family, but every choice pulled her in a different direction. And over time, the distance between the two could no longer be filled by effort alone. It became a reality that both had to face. When the marriage reached its end, it did not happen with loud noises, but with the realization that what had once connected them was no longer enough to keep them together. The divorce was not only the end of a relationship, but also the breaking of an image that Madonna had once believed in. The image of a stable family, of a place where she could stop. And what made everything more difficult was what involved the children, especially when disputes arose, not just legal issues but emotional ones. Because for Madonna, her children were not only a responsibility, but something she feared losing more than anything else. The disagreements about raising them, about where the children would live, about how they would grow up, all touched her deepest fear. The fear that once again she might lose the people she loved. And in that process, emotions were no longer simply sadness or disappointment, but became more complex, mixed with hurt, helplessness, and self-blame. Madonna continued to try to hold on to what she could, but not everything was within her control. And that was perhaps the hardest part, when a person who had grown used to control had to face things that could not be changed. After all, the marriage to Guy Ritchie not only left memories of a short, peaceful period, but also left deep lessons about the limits of control, about how not every effort leads to the desired result, and about how sometimes letting go is not failure, but the only thing that can be done. But even when she understood that, the feeling of loss still remained, not loud, not dramatic, but quietly existing, like a part of the story that Madonna continued to carry as she stepped into the next chapters of her life. And then, amid what was left after the broken marriage, another incident appeared in a way that Madonna had not prepared for at all. When her son Rocco made the decision to choose to live with his father, Guy Ritchie, it was not just a change in residence, but a moment that overturned the entire sense of control she had tried to maintain for many years. Because for Madonna, the relationship with her children had always been the most sacred thing, the place where she believed she could do better than what had happened in her own childhood. And when Rocco left, it was not simply a personal decision of a growing child, but became a direct touch on the deepest fear she had carried since she was little. The fear of abandonment, the fear that the people she loved could leave and could not be kept. Madonna had grown used to controlling her career, controlling her image, controlling the way the world perceived her. But in this relationship, she began to realize that not everything could be held tightly that way. Rocco was no longer a child who needed to be guided step by step. He began to have his own choices, his own thoughts, and his own desires that did not always match what Madonna believed was right. And that very difference created conflict, not once, but prolonged, repeated over and over. Each argument was not only about who was right or wrong, but about the way they viewed love, about the level of freedom a child needed, and about the level of control a mother felt necessary to protect. Madonna stood in the middle, wanting to keep her son close while fearing that holding too tight would make him drift further away. But loosening up made her feel she was losing something she could not bear. And so the relationship became a series of simmering tensions, not always exploding, but always existing as a constant pressure, moments of silence, distances not easy to fill, attempts to connect that did not achieve what was hoped for. All of it gradually accumulated into a feeling that Madonna could not easily name, both pain, loss, and helplessness. And deep down, that feeling was not new. It was similar to the feeling she had once experienced as a child, when her mother left without explanation, when everything changed without her having the right to control, when her position in the family became no longer certain. And that very repetition made the pain even deeper, because it was not only a current event, but the rekindling of a memory that had never been healed. Madonna was not only facing her son, she was facing her own past, facing the part of herself that had once felt left behind. And that made every reaction stronger, every emotion harder to control, even though on the outside she still tried to maintain the image of a strong mother, a woman who could not be shaken. Inside there was an endless internal struggle between holding and letting go, between controlling and accepting. And in that process, maintaining family connection became harder than ever, not because of lack of love, but because that love was covered by layers of fear, expectations, and old wounds. Madonna continued to try, continued to find ways to understand, to adjust, to keep what she could, but not every distance could be narrowed quickly. Some distances needed time, needed change from both sides. And while waiting for that, Madonna had to learn to live with the feeling of uncertainty, with not being able to control everything, with accepting that love did not always mean keeping the person she loved by her side. And that was perhaps the hardest lesson for a person who had spent her whole life avoiding the feeling of loss, but now had to face it in the most direct way. And then, when the distances in the family had not yet been fully healed, another challenge came in a way that could not be avoided. It was time, something Madonna could not control, even though she had mastered almost everything else in her life. Age did not come suddenly. It came slowly, quietly, but clearly enough to make a person who lived by image and presence like Madonna face it every day. In an industry where youth was often considered the standard, where new faces kept appearing, maintaining her position was no longer just a matter of talent or experience, but also a matter of image. And Madonna understood that better than anyone. She had built her entire career based on controlling the way she was perceived, and therefore, facing the changes of age was not just a natural process, but a direct challenge to the way she existed in this world. The small changes in appearance, in energy, in the way her body reacted to the work schedule, all became signals she could not ignore. But what made everything harder was not only the change from within, but the way the world reacted to it. Criticism began to appear more often, not only about the music, but about her appearance, about the way she chose to express herself, about whether she should continue to appear the way she had always done or not. The media no longer only praised, but began to question, began to compare, began to judge by standards that Madonna had once broken. And that created a new pressure. Not the pressure to succeed, but the pressure to prove that she was still relevant, still had value, still could stand on the same level with the new generations. Madonna did not choose to step back. She did not choose to disappear. On the contrary, she continued to appear, continued to work, continued to push herself into new projects, new performances, new ways of expressing that sometimes caused controversy, no less than what she had done in her early days. But this time, the controversy carried a different tone, no longer the rebellion of a young person breaking boundaries, but the confrontation of someone who had been in the industry for too long, but still refused to leave. And that very thing made Madonna the center of debates, not only about art, but also about age, about who had the right to continue and who should stop. In all of that, there was an emotion she did not easily admit, which was the worry of being forgotten. Not the worry of losing fame immediately, but the worry of gradually being replaced, gradually being pushed out of the center of attention. And for a person who had spent her whole life keeping that position, losing it was not just a career change, but a change in identity. Because if she was no longer the Madonna the world knew, then who would she be? That question was not always spoken out loud, but it existed in the decisions she made, in the way she continued to appear, in the fact that she did not allow herself to disappear from the public eye. Madonna continued to work not only out of passion but because that was the way to affirm that she was still here, still had a voice, still had a place. But every time she stepped on stage, every time she faced the lights and the judging looks, she was not only performing, she was also proving that time could not easily erase what she had built, that age could not define her value, and that she was not ready to become part of the past. But deep inside, this battle was not only with the world, but also with herself, between accepting the change and resisting it, between letting go and holding tight, between allowing herself to age naturally and continuing to maintain the image that had once brought her to the top. Madonna stood between those two choices, not easily leaning toward either. And in that very internal struggle, she continued to move forward, not because she did not feel tired, but because she did not know how to stop, did not know how to exist without having to prove something. And perhaps that was exactly what made her journey both admirable and heartbreaking. And then, at the age of 57, when many people had chosen to step back to find peace, Madonna still continued to stand where she had been familiar with for many decades, not because she did not feel tired, but because continuing seemed to have become an inseparable part of who she was. Madonna still maintained her career with an intensity that others could hardly understand, still stepped on stage, still created, still experimented, still found ways to bring new things in a world that she had helped shape, but that now kept changing in ways that no longer belonged to her generation. Every time she appeared, she was not only performing, she carried an entire history, an entire journey, entire memories that no one could see from the outside. And even though the lights were still bright, even though the music still played, the way she stood on stage was no longer the same as before, not because she had grown weaker, but because she had carried too much. The experiences, the losses, the unanswered questions, all present in a way that only those who had gone through enough time could understand. Madonna still kept nearly absolute control in her work, from the way she organized tours, to the way she chose her image, to the way she appeared before the public. Not much was left to chance. There was not much space for uncertainty because control was still the way she kept everything from falling into chaos. But at the same time, her personal life became more narrowed, not because of lack of opportunities, but because she became more selective. Fewer people were allowed into her private space. Fewer relationships were maintained long enough to become deep, not because Madonna did not need connection, but because she had learned that not every connection could last, and every loss left a mark that was hard to erase. Therefore, she kept distance, not to avoid others but to protect herself. In the moments without work, without schedule, Madonna lived with what had passed, memories that did not disappear with time, images of her childhood, of relationships that had ended, of decisions she had made. All coexisted like layers stacked on top of each other, not always clear but always present. There were times when she looked back and realized she had gone too far to turn back, but she was also not entirely sure about where she stood. And in that very ambiguity, she continued to move forward, because stopping meant having to face everything she had spent her whole life avoiding. Madonna was not someone who did not understand the value of peace, but for her, peace was not a state easily achieved. It did not come from stepping away from the lights, but from accepting what was inside. And that was a journey she was still continuing. At the age of 57, Madonna was no longer the young girl running away from the past, but she had not completely escaped it either. She was a woman who had achieved almost everything the world could offer, but still carried questions that no fame could answer. And that very thing made her image more complex. Not just an icon, but a human being who continued to live, continued to search, continued to try to hold on to what she had while learning to accept what she had lost. And perhaps that was exactly what made Madonna, at the age of 57, not only a legend, but also a proof that a person could continue to move forward even when she had never truly felt she had arrived. And when looking back at that entire journey, Madonna does not appear as a perfect story, but as a painting made from both light and the dark spaces that never disappear. She has achieved things that very few people in this world could reach. Fame, power, influence that spans many generations, a legacy that lies not only in the songs, but also in the way she changed how society views women, personal freedom, and the right to control one's own life. But parallel to those achievements are the losses that no award could ever compensate for. The relationships that could not be kept, the distances that could not be fully narrowed, the moments when she had to face herself with no lights left to cover her. Madonna has never truly achieved a state of complete stability in her personal life, because her life has always been in motion, always changing, always pulled between choices where no option was entirely right. And perhaps that is exactly the price of living at the peak for too long. When everything on the outside is controlled but inside, there always exist things that cannot be arranged as desired. And yet Madonna has never chosen to stop. She continues to maintain the strong image in front of the public. Not because she does not feel tired, but because that is the only way she knows to exist, to continue being present in a world that she helped create. Her legacy is not only the melodies that have become part of the memory of millions of people, but also a spirit, an attitude toward life, an affirmation that a woman can define herself without waiting for permission from anyone. And that very thing has made her influence go far beyond music, becoming part of culture, of ways of thinking, of the generations that follow. And even though she has gone through so many incidents, Madonna still continues to work, continues to appear, continues to create, not because she needs to prove anything to the world, but because continuing has become a part of who she is, a part that cannot be separated from the way she exists. And perhaps what is most memorable is not what she has achieved, but the fact that she has never completely collapsed, has never let the losses define her, even though they are always there like indelible marks. And it is precisely in that continuation, in still standing firm after everything, that Madonna is not only a legend, but a human being who has lived, has lost, has endured, and still chooses to keep moving forward, even when the road ahead does not promise the peace she has searched for throughout her entire life. The story of Madonna not only makes people admire, but also leaves a very deep feeling of heartache, because behind the image of a woman who controls everything is a journey full of silent losses that not everyone sees, from the death of her mother when she was still a child who did not understand, to the years in New York when she had to protect herself amid poverty and danger, then the broken relationships like with Sean Penn and Guy Ritchie, or the painful moment when her son Rocco chose to leave her. All of it shows a very real thing. Success cannot heal the wounds that formed too early. Madonna has tried to control her life as a way not to experience the feeling of abandonment again, but that very control sometimes creates distance in relationships. And that makes people both feel sorry for her and understand why someone so strong can still feel lonely. For American society, where individuality, success, and independence are highly valued, this story is a reminder that strength lies not only in how much one achieves, but also in the ability to maintain connections with those around. That pursuing a career to the end should not completely trade away personal life, and that childhood traumas, if not faced, can follow a person throughout their entire life. Madonna deserves to be honored not only for what she has achieved, but because she still continues to move forward while carrying wounds that never disappear. And perhaps the biggest lesson is not to become strong like her, but to learn how to be strong while still keeping softness, still allowing oneself to connect, to trust, and to heal before everything becomes too late. If the story of Madonna makes you reflect on the price of greatness, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a sign of respect for that not easy journey. Thank you for staying until the end, and see you again in the next video, where we will continue to explore the truths behind the spotlight that not everyone has the courage to face.